Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 14 of the Future of Work show, where each week I, along with a few guests, have a conversation around a topic that I think is going to be really important for all of us in understanding how to navigate our own futures and the future of our organization. For those of you who are joining us for the very first time, my name is Shalini, and I'm a co founder at Uncube. And I work at the intersection of people and organizations and the future of work, along with my colleague Jaspreet Bindra, who focuses on business and technology. And now for the topic of today. Now, across the world, and definitely in India, many organizations have thought of design thinking as a great way to make the organization itself much more innovative. And today, I have two guests who've worked in the area of innovation and design thinking for some 25 odd years and have tons of experience around how design thinking actually plays out in different organizations. And they're going to help me answer some of the questions around when does it work, when does it not, what can we learn from all of these experiences, and what can we really do better. So let me now introduce my guests. My first guest is Kelly Costello. Kelly Costello is the co-founder of Panorama Innovation. She's also a faculty member at Northwestern University and the Institute of Design at the Illinois Institute of Technology. Welcome to the show, Kelly. I'm so glad to have you here.
Thank you. It's very nice to be here.
Thank you, Kelly. My second guest is Param. Param is the Chief Design Officer at Fractal Analytics. But just before this, he was also the head of the Innovation Center at Dr. Reddy's. So he's another person with tons of experience and someone who's also going to be really well placed to talk about how design thinking really plays out in organizations. So welcome to the show, Param.
Thank you, Shalini. Lovely to be here and excited to talk to all of you.
No, me too. I was so delighted when both of you accepted, honestly. So listen, let me just start off by first asking you a very simple question. Both of you got interested in design thinking well before it really became a thing, right? So today it's rare to come across a large organization which has nobody trained in design thinking. But even if we go back, say, a decade, it was a relatively niche area. And there were only specific organizations, definitely IDEO, probably Dublin, and a few niche players who really focused on design thinking before it became as big a thing as it is today. So my first question is really, what got you interested in design thinking when you got into it several years ago?
So I don't know which one of you want us to start, but I can dive right in. I was always interested in humans. So my undergraduate degree was in anthropology and in communications. And, it's very exciting when your passion somehow aligns with the market, because I can tell you I didn't think that way at that age. I just wanted to spend as much time as I could learning about humans, what they did, why they did it. And was lucky enough to find my way to the Institute of Design, which had already started talking about this and in the power that it had in design, and then to work at Dublin, where those values were sort of translated into methods and approaches and, sort of a dedication to saying, no matter what we're designing, we're going to make certain that it works for the people that we're designing for.
Sure. Nice. What about you, Param?
Look, I think having been in India, the design ecosystem and the design education system, and also even more broadly, the industry was, has taken some time to mature and sort of get up to the same levels as the rest of the world, and is still catching up, I would say, right? And so, I think the level of awareness about design thinking was very, very poor or very non-existent even 10 years back.
Yeah.
And I would say not just in India, world over. I think even 10 years back, world over, I've been in traveled in the US and many other parts of the world, and there was not that much understanding, awareness, or even appreciation for that. Oh, there is something called design thinking, and this is what it does. And so I think that scenario has changed. I mean, phenomenally, right? And so I think my own interest in it was probably similar to Kelly's in that sense, though I didn't study anthropology, but I was always fascinated with the idea that how do human beings behave? How do people do things? Why do they do things? What makes people do the weird things that they do, right? And that sort of curiosity was always there. I've dabbled with photography on the, as a passion. There's so much of human behavior that's in photography that sort of inspired me as well, and it kind of feeds off of each other. But I think more professionally speaking, I think yes, I did come across companies like IDEO and Dublin. I mean, Dublin, of course, is one of my favorite companies. Kelly's had the fortune of working there, but I've followed their work for a long period of time, and that inspired me. IDEO, of course, and many other companies. And I eventually worked in IDEO much later in my life, but that was the early genesis of it. And many other individuals, like there's a person by name Jan Chipchase, who's a very celebrated design ethnographer, who was with Nokia back in the day when Nokia was at its peak. Seeing his blog, early in the 2000s was very inspiring. I mean, to see someone travel the world and capture the lives of consumers and bring that consumer world into the center of the business. So those are things that really inspired me.
Wow. And listen, for any of our viewers, if you've been interested in design thinking, do share what got you interested in the field itself. And today, I think that's what's really interesting. If you just scroll through people's profiles on LinkedIn, the number of people who list design thinking as one of their either primary or secondary or whatever third skill, it's just been almost an exponential rise.
I mean, it's fascinating, right? I mean, I always compare. I sometimes compare these, hype cycles, right? I mean, if you look at the hype cycle of design thinking in the last 10 years, it's gone mainstream. I mean, it's really gone mainstream.
Yeah.
One can argue that it's even sort of gone beyond the mainstream. And similarly, other cycles of hype that is going on, whether it's AI or whether it's anything else. So I see a lot of similarities there. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and I think, just sort of laying down how we're using the word design thinking is important. And especially to people that don't come from design or haven't been using that terminology, I like to compare it to sort of creative problem solving, because at the end of the day, it does align. And even the scientific method, right? We're looking at empirical information. We are looking at the world, the context. We're then using that to inform the development of a new product, service, or system. And so even if you don't come from a design background, if you are willing to open your mind, observe, take in new information, and then think about that as you're creating solutions, I think you're able to apply all the methods and use them in a meaningful way within your organization.
Now, that's really helpful to explain, because you are right. We almost assume that everybody is using design thinking in the same way, but that really may not be the case. So let me then ask you, just to help us understand the big question of whether design thinking can actually have an impact on culture, do you think that there are some cultural principles that are inherent in design thinking as a discipline to start off with? Kelly, do you want to go first?
There are. And it's interesting because I was teasing apart in my mind the difference between capabilities and culture, because we spend a lot of time building capabilities. So I do a lot of training. There's the methods, here are the tools. For that next step of truly impacting culture, I think it takes a different set of tools and conversations to have. But definitely in the context of thinking about how do you take the mindset of design thinking and have that impact, I think it's important to be inclusive. It's important to be curious. It's important to be iterative, and to, I don't want to say embrace failure, but definitely learn from it. Because sometimes I feel like when we say embrace failure, I can just sort of see these CEOs, the worried look come across their face, or the CFO trying to calculate the price of that risk in their minds. But the reality is that if we don't learn from our failures, then we really have not taken the opportunity to leverage some of these tools and methods in the most optimal way. So those are the kind of first things of being open, being curious, being inclusive. Param, do you have some as well that come to mind?
Yeah, I mean, look, the short answer is this, right? That yes, design thinking can indeed transform the culture of an organization. At the same time, I think I've sort of had enough war stories and battles that I've fought, which have made me believe that design thinking itself is not the only answer, right? And I think that's the humility that we need to have. That we can't think of design thinking as the universal answer to all the magic bullet answer to everything and anything. And we have to have the humility to understand that it is one of the elements that will make the cultural change happen or the success happen.
Param, if I may just dive in, do you think that there are cultural principles inherent in design thinking itself, and are they anything that you'd like to add over and above what some of the things Kelly mentioned as well?
I mean, at the heart of it, right? I mean, I always talk about design thinking as the way to understand design thinking is by getting to the essence of 4 principles, right? One is empathy, right, which is getting to look at the problem from the human perspective, and the human is every human being that is involved or is being impacted by that problem, right? Of course, the actual sort of people or people that are at the receiving at the heart of that problem, at the sort of the impact of it, but also the other people who are involved in the ecosystem or in the solution sort of space. The second, that's one, which is how do you fundamentally rethink the problem from their perspective, or imagine their world, and understand why they do what they do. The second principle is reframing the problem, which is, can we reframe the problem from their vantage point, right, and not just from a business standpoint or from a technology standpoint or from a operational standpoint or whatever, right? I mean, there is a business need always, but how do you it's a world of and, it's not or. It's business problem and there's a customer need that you're trying to solve, right? So it's both, and both being equally important. The third one is the idea of abductive thinking. I mean, it sounds complicated, but if you strip away the jargon, what it really means is asking what if, right? Asking an imaginative question, saying what if this could be this way, right? And that's where you start thinking about solutions. And I think we don't do that enough in business, right? In large companies, there is this fear of asking what if, right? There is this fear of, if I ask this what if question, or if I suggest this what if idea, I have to have thought through it, and I have to have a right answer, and I have to have made sure that I have all the answers in my head before I can propose something, right? And so there is this fear aspect which prevents people from asking what if. And then the fourth principle is about rapid prototyping, right? Which is that don't develop some ideas thinking that these are brilliant ideas sitting in your office space, even if it went through a design thinking process. We get out there, make something within a few days, within a few hours, put it out there in front of some real people that really know this problem or are being impacted by it, and develop that solution with them and through that sort of iterative process. And so these are the 4 principles in my mind. If you strip away all the jargon behind design thinking, this is at the heart of what design thinking does at the level of principles.
So, Param, let me ask you, and this question particularly relates to the fact that you've had the experience of heading an innovation center in, in an organization which is not a tech company. Yep. So, where perhaps some of these ideas may have been different from the dominant culture.
Yep.
Can you share a little bit about what happens when the cultural principles of design thinking, sort of play out in an organization which has its own cultural heritage, and it might be quite different, in fact. So how does that play out?
Yeah. Well, I mean, love to write a book on that sometime if I can, but that's a huge topic. It was a 5-year journey. I was with Dr. Reddy's, a pharmaceutical company, which has presence in more than 50 countries, I guess, around the world, right? And it's an Indian, started originally in India, but literally now globally, present. And so when I started working with Dr. Reddy's, I was at IDEO first. They were a client of ours, and then that's the first time I worked with a pharmaceutical company, and I remember asking, what are we doing working with a pharmaceutical company? It was a little, contrarian for me in my head, even though I'm open about, applying design thinking everywhere. So it was a little abstract at that level. That what do you do applying design thinking for a pharmaceutical company? And so as we started working through that, I think the biggest thing that we were doing is trying to see, can we make, having, getting better in our health for patients, can we make that process better, right? Can we make that experience better? Can we make medicines more human, right? I mean, uh, none of us who fall sick, and all of us have at some point of time, unfortunately, when we are in that journey to get better, having medicines is not something that we look forward to, right? And at the same time, there is so much around that, and in that journey of getting better, there are so many unanswered questions in healthcare. There are so many areas where we are struggling as patients to figure out, how do I do this? How do I do that? Should I make this decision? Should I make that decision? And so I think there was a great opportunity that Dr. Reddy saw in saying that, can we go beyond the medicine? And that's really where the genesis of setting up Studio 5B, which is eventually what we call Studio 5B, got conceptualized. And that was the fundamental reason that, can we think of healthcare from a patient perspective, and can we make the experience of getting better in our health a lot more human? That was the genesis of it, right? So now, in that premise, obviously what I spoke about as principles of design thinking completely works very well with this mandate, right? It was sort of very, very natural, and you don't have to fit that in. So the whole aspect of empathy, you obviously have to start by understanding, what does the patient need? How does the patient look at a medicine, right? I mean, the fact that patients don't like having medicines, how does that change the way you think about their experience of having medicines? Or for that matter, the decisions that they make about, which doctor to go to, or which treatment to take, or whether to take a second treatment, second consultation or not, whatever, right? Whatever big decisions they're making. So I mean, there's a lot that we sort of uncovered within that, and so I think it was premise was that, yeah, how do we make healthcare experience more patient centric? Yeah.
No, but were you also able to impact culture? Because one of the challenges is that sometimes design thinking works really well in the innovation center. And because the focus is on products. And of course, that itself is hugely, I mean, it's a huge achievement, because it's, there are so many innovation centers that get set up and then shut down as well, because, they didn't have that kind of impact on the organization's business. So it's a huge accomplishment. But do you think that the work that you did, or the way you started thinking in the innovation center itself, had an impact on the culture of the organization in a larger way?
I'd like to feel that, yes, I mean, the needle moved forward, significantly. I mean, it's been 6 years now since originally I started at Dr. Reddy's, and we set up Studio 5, and I moved on last year from there. But it's been 6 years. It's very much alive and thriving, and building from strength to strength, and the body of work has increased over time. And so few examples of change that I think I've seen, right? The fact that many people in the executive team remember some patient stories, right? Some real stories from people's lives in terms of what their challenges are in dealing with healthcare, and they remember these stories not just 3 months or 4 months or 5 months down the line, literally 5 years later. When a senior exec has heard a story about a patient 5 years back, and then they are narrating that story to the rest of the organization 5 years later about that patient and what they struggled with. That's phenomenal, right? I mean, that is unheard of. So, I mean, so that's a great example of how culture, a little bit of that culture changed. The other example is, for example, things like even the way that internal organizational systems work, right? The way the performance management system was set up in Dr. Reddy's, that was completely reimagined using design thinking. And that journey is still unfolding, or I believe, but there's been a big difference there. Also, things like thinking about going beyond the patient, beyond the medicine of a pharmaceutical company, not just thinking about the product, but thinking about services that would help the patient in their journey to get better, even though it may not traditionally make business sense, right? Because all the patient is paying for is the medicine. Those are things that the company tried and succeeded on many counts, not just in India, but Russia and Latin America and so on. So I think those are all very tangible signs of having impacted. I mean, it's not overnight. It's not to say that everyone in the 20,000 people has transformed, but I think the needle definitely moved forward on many of those people in the company.
Thanks. Kelly, what have your experiences been like? You've also worked with so many organizations across the spectrum.
I was thinking a lot about the comment that you made, and Param, when you were speaking of teasing apart the process from the true sort of cultural principles, because reframing is sort of part of the process. Now, the cultural principle is, are you open to reframing and will you accept the reframe, right? And so on either side of that, of just engaging in the first place and then sustaining that over time are both critical to have true cultural change. And there's two factors of culture, right? Sort of the internal culture and then the impact that your organization has on the culture and in the way in which it interacts with others. And, it's hard to think of examples where people have accomplished all three, where they've got an innovative process and approach in place where they're truly empathetic to their users, and where they're truly then reflecting on their own culture, turning that sort of critical eye internally, and then changing the way that they interact with one another, and then also able to sort of affect change externally. I mean, the example that sort of comes to mind is I love Satya Nadella and the things that he has to say about empathy. It's really compelling. And then I use a Microsoft product, and I think, why did they make it so hard to save a PowerPoint file in the new version? There's this little thing, so it's really hard to be effective on all levels. And I think when we talk about cultural change, that's what we sort of think of, or at least what I'm thinking of that truly sort of 360-degree area of impact. And that's harder to achieve. The other example that comes to mind is IBM. They have made huge strides in building this whole design thinking practice. And then they built a wonderful, because a lot of times innovation gets killed because it's expensive. The minute that you say we need to do research on the front end and research in the middle, and we want to be iterative and we want multiple cycles through our process, and then we're going to take it to market and we're already going to start thinking about how do we change it next once it gets out there and get that feedback. That kind of scrutiny, that kind of engagement is quite expensive. And if you can't translate that into ROI, companies won't sustain it over time. And I feel like that's why we see these innovation teams come up, rise, do great things in a company. It's not translated to ROI within a few years, and then bam, the team's gone. And it's either really everybody's gone overnight, or a more sort of humane way is they find other ways to place them within the company, and then maybe some of those principles get disseminated. So I think we're asking a lot for it to happen on all fronts, because with IBM even, they came up with a great report, and I can put it in the chat and share it with everyone, of like, what did we achieve by implementing design thinking? And it was like faster alignment on teams, better designs and user understanding, cutting design defects in half. Like, those are very tangible areas of impact that then allow you to say, we want to change our internal culture. And that means that we have to do a lot of sort of navel gazing, for lack of a better word, of like, where are we now on that trajectory and where do we want to go in this path, and spend time and energy on your people and helping them develop, knowing that they may walk out the door because the average tenure has changed. So I do feel like we're making great strides. I think having the process in place, having the commitment to the people within your organization to support them through incentives and through sort of reinforcement as they sort of take this path. And then these commitments to these principles of, embracing change, being diverse. And those examples are fewer, but I feel like companies excel on one or the other. So that's kind of like taking the lens and looking out, living in it, like living in Dublin. We were very aligned in our approach, and that was wonderful. I think sometimes we weren't accepting of outsiders. So if we hired people that had a different approach to innovation, we're like, no, that's the wrong approach to innovation. You have to do it this way. You have to learn about the user. You have to do these things, this process we were committed to. So if you fundamentally sort of challenge the approach, I think that's probably where we're like not as accepting in what someone else might bring or add to the culture and the way that they think about problem solving.
You're right, Kelly. Those are the really hard ones, right? Like the process is a little bit easier, and if you have enough of maybe a strategy around innovation and you have some successes, then the adoption of some of the design thinking processes in different parts of the organization, like Param, you spoke about, how it was applied to the performance management system, and perhaps I'm sure there must have been other examples like that as well. But at times there's the culture of the organization and the fundamental cultural principles behind design thinking might be different. Like you said, the acceptance of can we just explore the entire or a much larger set of possibilities than the one that we're familiar working with? How do we deal with differences of views? Is that normal, or is that something that sort of interrupts our process? How do we deal with even power distance? What does hierarchy mean? Because one of the things I found really interesting the very first time I read about design thinking and watched a few courses was how egalitarian the process was designed to be. So power distances were almost minimized by design, so that the best ideas had an opportunity to emerge. But that's not really the way a lot of decision making in organizations happens. And particularly for organizations which have, had a more traditional, sort of trajectory, some of these principles are actually quite different. Just give me a second. I'm going to read through some of the comments. Niharika says, good evening. Hi, Niharika. Gurmukh, good evening. Gurmukh asks, is it like mind mapping? Is it?
Well, that was one reason why I said earlier, what did we commit to, or what are we talking about when we use the word design thinking? I think of mind mapping as a tool that we use to expand our thoughts and to really think about something differently and look for associations in a creative way. But I don't equate the two. I sort of feel like design thinking is up here, and then here's a tool, mind mapping, and we're going to use it in this situation because we need to expand our thinking.
Right. Niharika says, design thinking unleashes creativity and innovation. Certain brainstorming is essential in every organization. That was in response to Gurmukh's question. Pramod says, design thinking is quite a radical way to look at a problem. Pramod says, people matters. Anil Menon says, future of medicine is to have wellness products. I think that must have been in response to you, Param, how innovation is taking in this specific area, which company in India is focusing on this, and how approval agencies are changing those policies. Anil, I'm just going to keep the approval process out of it just because our focus is different. But to answer the other question which Anil asked, Param, are there other pharma companies which you think are as engaged with design thinking as Dr. Reddy's is?
I mean, I'm not aware, to be honest. And I'm biased because obviously I worked in Dr. Reddy's, and so, but I'm not aware of any other company in the pharma space in India. But abroad, in other countries, there are many pharma companies that have taken to design in a big way, including Abbott and Novartis and many other sort of firms. So it is something, Eli Lilly and so on. So there's a lot of companies that have done a lot of interesting work in pharma around the world.
Right.
I think in India it's still. I mean, Dr. Reddy's was very, very early on that front.
Fantastic.
And kind of in that arena, I think of somebody like Mayo Clinic who, had the Spark Lab early on. They're not a pharma company, obviously, but within healthcare, the broader picture, definitely have seen, providers think about how do we put the patient front and center. And so they, years ago started the Spark Lab, and then now they have an innovation center. And I think they do a good job of how do we keep the patient in the center of the experience, and how do we make the impact on their lives and minimize the impact on their lives. It's to the point that Param made, no one wants to take medicine and no one wants to be sick. But if you do have to be in that situation, how do we have a more humane way of approaching it? I have worked with pharma companies using design thinking, but more in the context of product innovation. So we want to learn about our users' needs, but we want to basically learn about them, obviously, to sell more product. And so, we have done a lot of sort of innovation projects and applied design thinking in those contexts. And so I do feel like there's more of maybe there's a tier of embracing, how do we make more product? How do we create a better experience? And then how do we truly make people's lives better? And, to take that first step of even saying we care about our customer, we want to do something better for them, it's sort of the threshold, right?
Yeah.
That's a great point that Kelly just brought up, that, which is that, there are probably many companies that are using design thinking for transforming a product or a business or a, specific aspect of a business issue or whatever. But there are probably much less, and a few that are even attempting to transform the company using design thinking. Right, and there, that number is growing and has grown significantly in the last 5 years, but it is still a minority. A smaller measure or a smaller number compared to the first lot. And I think that's much more audacious. It's much bigger. It's much more difficult. It's complex, and it needs to come. It needs to come from the top. That stuff cannot be done, at a product level or a project level or whatever. So it's interesting. So
And I'm just going to take 2 more questions and then jump right back in. Gurmukh asks whether there are any examples in airports. Kelly, I'm wondering if you've had any experiences, because airports do seem like a really good place for, some of design thinking's principles to work.
Well, it's funny. I've definitely sent my students out to airports to try to redesign the experience. They seem to have gotten more humane, but I haven't personally had the chance to work with them on that. Definitely worked with airlines, rethinking the passenger experience once you get on the plane. But not as many examples working within the airport corridors themselves, but they certainly need it. And maybe, I don't know, Param, has IDEO done any work in that space that you
I'm sure they have. I remember there were a few cases, but I'm not familiar with them personally. Look, airports, think of them as, if you think about travel as an experience, right? There's so much that you can do in that, and there's so many emotional pain points and needs and opportunities there. So, and of course, now in a post-COVID world, it's only much more complex and much more important.
Right. So Tyler has a question. Sorry, can I take it?
I was surprised you might do this one, because I'm not. I was just reading this. Go ahead. Sorry.
Tyler's question is, what are your takes on the cultural shift or mental model shifts by the large project, big innovation, usual type advances versus picking up the smaller everyday road bumps like saving a PowerPoint? And
I'm going to go a different direction a little bit on this. But I think they're both important. I feel like if you make the big shifts and you don't solve the small problems, everybody suspects that there's terrible things lurking in the dark corners that they can't see. So I do feel like you have to go sort of after both. I think there's a sexiness to ambitious projects, and then you get people are dismissive of the smaller things, and so you end up sort of in an odd, out of balance thing where you talk about the lofty goals, and then the everyday experience is really terrible. But one thing I do see is quite positive in that front is cities adopting innovation at the civic innovation level. So, through the work that Bloomberg Philanthropies has been doing and other organizations around, hey, can we take some of this innovation and the things that we do for companies and put a different lens on it and try to solve everyday problems of being residents in cities, and how do we shift that? And I do feel like that can be everything from lowering fines on parking tickets, those everyday bumps, to having a more inclusive representation in the makeup of city decision makers. And so, I don't know if that exactly answers the question, but I think we all have to commit to both. And 2, I see the shift in the fact that, cities are now saying, how do we really help our citizens on an everyday basis?
And I know you do a lot of work with cities. If I remember correctly, you've been working with cities for many years now. So for all our viewers, Kelly sits on as an advisor, if I remember correctly, and jury member for,
Yes.
am I getting that right? For projects of innovation on building better cities across the world.
Advisor sounds a little more lofty. I'm a coach. But I like the idea of advisor. It sounds like less work. The coach is really taking the design process and getting people to apply it in projects in the city, and then also adopt the mindset as well. But it's great because one of the principles we sort of hold near and dear is that you need senior leadership to sponsor and support innovation change. And so they start at the mayor level. And so literally they get mayors from different cities across not only the United States, but around the world, to share ideas with one another, to sort of commit to action. And so that's been very exciting to see. And now you see more and more chief innovation officers within cities. And so those are the things that make me feel like, okay, we're not only just talking the talk, but we're walking the walk as well, in that way.
How important is it, and this question is for both of you, how important is it not just for senior leaders to sponsor, because that I can completely get, but to themselves understand, some of what goes into design thinking to be able to really make a shift? What are your experiences?
I'll take a first crack at it. Look, I think the bigger the magnitude of change that you're trying to drive in an organization, and the bigger impact you want, right? The bigger the ambition is, then it's directly proportional to that. The more the senior execs have to get involved, have to not just be sponsoring it, but also be part of the process. And it's really important. I mean, one is of course the messaging of it and to communicate the seriousness and the commitment and the intent behind that initiative to the rest of the organization. The other is also for them to change in that process, right? I mean, I'll give you a couple of examples, right? One of the stories is that there was a CEO who we were working with back in my consulting days, and we were working on this project of going through this process and design thinking and applying it to a very strategic problem sponsored by the CEO himself and all of that. And halfway through the project and through the process, the CEO was getting frustrated, saying, where's this going? I mean, this is, he was used to a traditional sort of management consulting, think McKinsey, think Bain, whatever, the big, consulting
More prescriptive.
firm. Yeah, I mean, I won't even call it prescriptive. It's just a different process, right? I mean, it's just a different process and a different mental model, right? And so you were used to that, and so you expect a certain visibility, certain linearity, certain outcomes, and certain predictability to the outcomes. And this process was much more non-linear, much more consumer-centric, human, emotional, and very, very different. And so halfway through, he was like, this is just completely rubbish. Let's just can this project and get rid of it or whatever. But thankfully he persisted, and he started getting a little more involved and saying why we're doing what we're doing. And of course we had to also explain that process a little better and unfold that and handhold him through that. But at the end of it, he was just completely transformed, and he took to design in a way that was just amazing. I mean, I would probably even say that he gets design better than most designers that I know. So and so I think it is very important that people at the exec level are not just sponsoring it, but are also part of the process, because their mindset shifts, their thinking shifts, and their way of looking at their company changes, and that is much bigger an impact than just sponsoring it.
Kelly? I think too, it's important for the C-suite to be engaged. In other words, you can have a CEO that gets a vision, is very excited and very bought in. And I was working with an organization where the CEO was bought in, the CFO was somewhat bought in, the CIO was bought in, but not the CMO. So what would happen is there would be all of this innovation work done on the front end, and then when it got to actually getting the product on the shelf, the whole process broke down. And so I think that that's the other important thing of this alignment and really getting the team sort of equally engaged, so it doesn't sort of it doesn't feel siloed. And that sort of interdisciplinary approach is critical. And then also getting a good portfolio together. In other words, I think, earlier I was talking about people get excited about the sexy, we're transforming the industry. And then you look at your pipeline and it's all these very pivotal, sort of higher risk, potentially higher reward directions. But then the pipeline below that sort of fall into the side. And you really need a sort of robust, diverse portfolio in innovation and think about it more strategically to say, okay, we know we're going to take a risk. How much risk are we willing to take? And how are we going to complement that with these sort of smaller innovations that are coming out the door? And so that kind of very diverse way of thinking that is, everything doesn't hinge on this one idea, because then it can become so pivotal that if it doesn't work, then you put the company at risk and they're like, woof, we're not doing that anymore. That was crazy. What were we thinking? And so I feel like that piece of it as well.
And I think to build on that, right, I think the point about changing culture, there are two things I want to share here. One is that I think changing culture is a long-term, benefit or an outcome that we're looking for. It doesn't happen overnight. Obviously, it's much more difficult to feel and experience, especially when you're seeing your culture every day. It's a bit like losing weight. I mean, you can't see yourself losing weight every day because you see yourself every day, right? If you took pictures of yourself over the period of several months, or if someone saw you after several months or weeks, then they can say, hey, yeah, you look like you've lost weight. But you can't see it because you're seeing yourself every day. So culture is a bit like that. You can't feel it every day. And so I think what is important is that how do you translate that into projects? Because you're not going to say, I'm going to do a culture initiative. I mean, that's very abstract. That's very theoretical. What you have to do is define what is the kind of cultural shift you want. For example, we're feeling that we're very hierarchical right now, or that, we're not collaborating across functions or disciplines or departments. So if that's the change that you want to become more cross-functional or collaborative, then, what projects can you do to increase the level of collaboration as a means to get to that outcome in the business context? But through that business outcome that you create, the way you go about it would improve the way you collaborate, right? And you keep a needle, focus on that. So projects is where rubber hits the road. Projects is where things become tangible. And you need both the variety of projects that Kelly was speaking about. You need the transformative, sexy, sort of hero projects, or, ideal, role model projects. Those are more for, inspiration. And those are definitely important for transformation as well. But you also need a lot more of the incremental, how do you move the needle a little bit here, a little bit there, stuff that you can see that can happen, change in the next 1 month or one quarter or whatever. So that's, I think, one big thing. I think the other last quick point I'll make on culture is another realization I've had is that, much as we are deep in the world of design thinking and we feel that, we're bringing change, we're doing all of this fancy stuff, and we have the pressure of showing ROI and all of that. One thing I've realized is that it's not just us. I think every department in the organization is struggling with ROI, and many other departments in the company are, right? Take HR, for example. I think HR is one of the most, I think, misunderstood departments and underutilized departments in every organization, right? And most HR professionals that I know of are struggling to create impact or struggling to show the benefit of what they do to the organization. And the rest of the organization is so hard on them, saying, what have you done? What's the impact? Where's the ROI? And similar with marketing. I mean, there's so much of what marketing does is difficult to quantify or difficult to show that, we did this and this is what it ended up with. And so I think, as designers or people in the design thinking world of working should be a little easy on themselves about the fact that it's not just us who are struggling with ROI or quantifying it. It's not easy to quantify it.
No, so that makes sense. But I just want to summarize a few key points because I don't want them to get lost. I really liked, Param, what you said about, when I asked you about the sponsorship part, and you spoke about how the leader must be transformed in the process themselves. I thought that was a really good point because, that's a different way to look at it, that the leader gets transformed in the process itself. And that transformation or the growth of the leader, is a key driver in perhaps the leader being as excited about it or being able to, go through the challenges which it inevitably will throw up. Kelly, I loved what you said about how it's not just, in fact, one or two members of the C-suite, but the entire team who has to understand. And I think that's a really interesting perspective too, because I think it's not so common for an entire team to necessarily take such a deep dive into design thinking and learn to use that lens in the way problems are addressed. The other thing, Param, which you spoke about, the challenge between familiar ways of problem solving and the kinds of techniques which design thinking shows us, and the challenge of feeling comfortable in one when you have sort of spent a lot of your life on the other. I think that's a very, very real challenge in many organizations. Kelly, I absolutely love what you spoke about the portfolio, the fact that it's not about one project, but it's about having a very well mapped out portfolio. And the reason I'm sort of highlighting all these points are because to me, they begin to answer some of the questions about what does it really take for design thinking, not just to be a tool that's applied for better products, which of course it must, and of course it has a huge role to play there, but what might lie behind organizations using design thinking as, I won't say as a tool for transformation, but having used design thinking, land up experiencing a transformation. I'm wondering if there are other thoughts that either of you have on this specific issue. What makes it work?
Well, I was thinking a lot. Oh, Param, sorry.
No, go ahead. I
was thinking a lot of the comment that Param said, culture is a little bit like losing weight. You don't see it, but it may be happening every day. And one of the models we use around that, that some colleagues came up with, was the Propeller model. And you have purpose in the middle, you have process, people, and structure. And then to the point that you were saying, Param, as part of that, I think the projects, right? Because those are where it lives in the everyday basis. Mm-hmm. But if you say, I want to impact culture and say, what do I do next? If you go right after culture, it's not going to work. But if you go after the levers that impact culture, then you're much more likely to have success, because you're saying we need to tackle all this. We need to make certain that our people are embracing these principles and are learning the process and applying it in everyday lives, because you definitely see exhaustion when you come in and run workshops and like, oh, what is the innovation flavor of the month? And making certain that you're committed to systemic change, because if they don't see it, they start to lose faith. And then the process itself, sort of sharing that, being collaborative, and taking on a lot of the mindset of and the different steps of design thinking. And then the structure itself, because if you can't sustain it, and it just feels like a one and done, then you don't have the kind of cultural impact that you want to have long term. And so I think the Propeller model as sort of an icon has been very helpful in thinking about, okay, how do we impact cultural change without like saying, today we're going to have cultural change, and people are like, uh-oh, are we going to have one of those est moments locked in a hotel somewhere? Please tell me it's not happening. And to really say, no, that really means that in the long run, we're going to commit to making better products, being a better company, and making positive change.
Nice.
I want to share a few thoughts on that in terms of how it's very similar to what Kelly was sharing, that this whole sort of the journey of change, right? And at one level, bringing a design thinking led culture or way of thinking in a company is no different from any other change that a company is trying to make, right? A large, kind of cultural change. So in that sense, it's very similar and symbolic to any cultural shift any organization is trying to make. That level is no different. But from a design perspective, right, there are a few things that I've seen work well. One is starting with, what is the reason for existence for design in an organization, right? And that speaks to the point that Kelly spoke about purpose, right? So I'll give you two examples, right? One, the current organization where I am at Fractal, and the other is Dr. Reddy's, where I was before. At Dr. Reddy's, the purpose of the company was good health can't wait. Good health talks about, how can we be more patient-centric, which I spoke about earlier. Can't wait speaks about how do you, solve healthcare problems in a way that have not been solved before with urgency? And therefore, how do you think differently about it? Therefore, how do you think creatively about it, right? Mm-hmm. And so the aspect of empathy and creativity is embedded in the purpose of the organization. And so design sits right at the heart of that, which is that design therefore becomes an enabler for bringing empathy and dynamism and creativity into the organization. Right?
Very nice.
And for therefore that to translate into the way the organization brings medicines or healthcare to the patient, right? So it's fundamentally central to the reason for existence of the organization, not just conceptually, but in a real sort of sense, right? In my current organization, the purpose of Fractal is to power every human decision in the enterprise, right? Now, if you take that, I mean, it's at the what we do on a day-to-day basis is use AI to transform a company, but in our purpose or mission statement, it's really about powering every human decision. Now, how do you power every human decision if you don't understand the human involved in that? How do you understand how human beings make decisions? How do you understand what goes on before, what goes on after, during, whatever, right? And where can AI play a role, not just in being the hype technology, but how can you actually solve and make things better for that human being making that decision? So you need empathy for that. You need behavioral science for that. You need design for that. You need all of these things to come into the center of transforming that. So that's the first step, which is knowing why does design exist in the organization and how that ties in with the purpose of the company. The second is, the aspect of translating that into a series of projects or outcomes which are real, which are tangible, which are both near term and long term, where you show those aspects of purpose being translated into reality. And then, of course, you need an org structure, you need an enabling mechanism right at the top to make sure that you have seat at the table, you have the right team and the organizational mandate and enabling systems to make that happen, right? So I think that's how I've seen these are some important ingredients which are important to come together. And the last thing that I'll say, important ingredient, which I've learned the hard way, is it's not enough to just take the C-suite along. Having the C-suite sponsorship is great, and that's an important prerequisite for cultural change. But the second most important thing is what's below the C-suite, the next level and the level below that. Those folks are the ones who lead the business on a day-to-day basis. They get the shit done, every day, right? And so if they are not bought in, and if they feel like, the C-suite has told me to do this, and therefore I'm having to do this, sorry, you've lost the plot.
Yeah.
So, and so those are some things that I've seen work, as important things.
No, I think there's some really good points. Putting the purpose of the organization being so well tied into why design thinking, and that kind of integration being really central to the success of design thinking within that organization in the first place. And I absolutely, it makes sense that while, of course, understanding and perhaps, like as you said, being transformed by design thinking right at the top is helpful, but it doesn't end there. Layers below that also need to be integrated. So I'm just going to take the last few questions. I realize we're coming to an end to our time. So, hi Rahul. Anshuman says, would you want to use design thinking in some special situations? Like innovation, it has the risk of being yet another fad till the next one comes around.
It's a really good point. The thing though about this fad is now I've been doing it for 25 years, and I don't think we get to put innovation to the side, frankly, or we won't survive. I think there's some big problems we still have to tackle, whether it's climate change and or true inclusion or more economic equity. And so I would love to say, oh, that was a fad. Now we don't have to do that anymore. That was a lot of hard work. But the reality is we can't afford to do that either as a culture, a species, or as workers. But I do feel like the tools that you might use and the language you might use evolve. So early on it was like design planning, and then getting designed a seat at the table, and and now sort of design thinking. And so I know some people that just hate using the word because they're like, oh, it's just another fad. But I do feel like creative problem solving is not going away. So if we say that it's a mindset and a tool set that allow you to look at the world in a different way, that piece of it, I think, we should all stay firmly committed to, because we need it and we're going to continue to need it. And, so yes, is it a fad? Somewhat, but it's a very useful one. And it's certainly yielded some good results. I do feel like this piece of being innovative and making innovative product has now more successfully than turned inside, because you do see people saying, you know what, I work for a tech company in Silicon Valley and I'm a woman and I'm not treated well. So why can't we take this empathy and why can't we take this lens that we talk about for our customers and quit being hypocrites and turn it internal, and people of color as well. So I do feel like, not to say that design thinking somehow, spearheaded the resistance, but I do feel like it has caused us to say, how are we truly empathetic, and how do we truly have a unique purpose that does make both our world and the worlds of those of others that that we interact with on a daily basis better. So I'm hoping that's not a fad.
No, it's a really good point. The fact that design thinking lends itself so well to ask some of these questions and bring about, some of these transformations. It's a very valuable tool for change in that sense. Param, you were saying something?
No, I mean, I think the only thing I'll add is that I think more and more we need to start living in a world of and. Every tool set or every toolkit or every part of that toolkit, has its own importance. I mean, you need design thinking. You also need AI. You also need big data. You also need any other way of problem solving. I think no one particular tool is perfect or complete enough in its entirety. And so I think, I mean, is it a fad? Yes, it has been a fad. I'm glad it was a fad, because 10, 15 years back, one had to convince people or explain what design was. The fact that HBR has done cover stories on design has made my job much easier, because people are a lot more educated or aware about it now, and I don't need to convince as much. But it has created awareness, it has created interest, it has created a pull for it. As with any other fad, it will reach a state where people will feel like, okay, it's mainstream now and it's not new anymore. But that doesn't mean that it's not required anymore. It still is required. So it's like marketing, like HR and marketing were new things in corporate world maybe 30, 40 years back. There was probably no HR department maybe 50 years back. And it's now exactly. So that's the point. I mean, everything will go through an evolution, and design will become a department that will exist in every part of the organization tomorrow. And that's a good thing. The fact that it's no longer a fad.
Anything, any last words, Kelly?
No, well, I will build on this one thing you mentioned earlier, Param, about like it's not design thinking alone, and I like the idea of the and approach. And I've just started reading a book, Wired to Resist, and I think that's the one other area that we really need to think more about. Of like, okay, it's great to have this innovative front end, but if it doesn't sort of permeate all the way through to what we're putting out into the world and how we engage with the world, then it sort of just becomes a brainstorming feel good moment, and we don't really impact things. So I do feel like the piece of why are we wired to resist change, and how do we overcome those fears and build the courage to try new things is another area where we can sort of successfully collaborate with neuroscientists and psychologists and sociologists and others to continue to think about that organizational cultural change that we're talking about.
No, thank you.
I do have a last thing that I would love to sort of put out there. That I think as part of getting mature in this hype cycle, I hope we reach a point soon when people realize that being in design, in brainstorming workshops or so-called design thinking workshops for 1 hour, 2 hours, and thinking that you've done a design thinking course for one day, I'm tired of that. So I wish people would realize that you can't learn anything in one day. I mean, forget design. It's not something that you can get awareness, but it doesn't mean that you will walk out of the door becoming a design thinking practitioner or expert in those 2 days. So I think people need to temper their expectations and realize that just like any other skill, it takes time to build, and it needs 10,000 hours of practice before you get mastery. So
right.
So that's
Well said.
one sort of thing that I feel hopefully that light bulb will come on at some point for people.
No, very well said. I think some great points across the board. And I absolutely love the fact that in the end we spoke about just, well, I won't know if I should call it fad, but certainly it's become mainstream. It's become hugely popular. A lot of people are proud to call themselves design thinkers. And as more and more people get a taste of it or dive much, much deeper, it'll probably become easier for organizations to be able to speak the language of design and acquire the mindset of design as compared to, some years ago when this was still a very niche area with only a few people in it. So with that, I realize we're at the end of the hour. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Param. This was such a pleasure. It was such an important topic for us to discuss. And thank you so much for having made the time to join us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Kelly. Lovely talking to both of you.
Yes, good to meet you. Bye.
Bye.